Everybody, and welcome to a conversation with Tanya Plibersek. I'd like to formally welcome the Honourable Tanya Plibersek, Shadow Minister for Education and Shadow Minister for Women. Thank you very much for giving up your time in this really busy week in the lead up to Saturday's election to answer some questions from parents of Australia. We're really pleased that you could find some time to do that with us, so thank you for that. And before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're meeting. For me, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I also acknowledge that this land was never ceded. Tanya, thank you for being here, and I'd like to invite you to just give us a brief outline of Labor's education policies as we're heading into the election this weekend.
Oh, thank you very much, Sharon. And I want to start by thanking you for having me today. I'm delighted to talk to you and to have this recorded for anybody who might be interested who isn't with us today. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respect to elders past and present. I'm really excited about Labor's education policies going into this election, and they go from early childhood education and care through schools, TAFE and university, but I'll just focus on the schools policy because I know it's the thing that is of most interest to your members at the moment. I think the first and most important thing to say is we want to work with states and territories to get every underfunded public school to 100% of its schooling resource standard. The current agreements with states and territories expire in December 2023, as all of you know, and we want to work with states and territories in the meanwhile to work out how we get public schools onto that 100% of their fair funding level, the trajectory for that. We've made some important announcements in the meanwhile, because we know that we can't wait till the end of 2023 to address some of the glaring needs in our schools. So probably the first and most important one is the $440 million that we've set aside. About half of that is for student wellbeing, particularly helping kids bounce back after COVID-19. And that can be used at a school level for things like additional counselling, social workers, school psychologists, or even things like tuition or school camps or sports, just basically to get kids re-engaged and back on track. About $10 million of that is to be set aside for the development and rollout of a voluntary mental health screening tool for kids at primary school age, so that we can pick up kids who are suffering from things like anxiety earlier and connect them to the supports they need earlier. The other half of that money is for capital. So 50 million is for small upgrades that would help schools be more sort of COVID safe. So covered outdoor learning areas, upgrading, classrooms, being able to open windows and doors that have been painted shut, air filters and so on. But $180 million of that is solely set aside for public school capital upgrades. We know that that's about the same amount that will be spent on non-government schools, over the next couple of years. We want to match that for public schools, and that's a reminder as well that we see a role for the Commonwealth in capital, making sure that our schools have great facilities, our public schools have great facilities too. And we've got a range of other policies, including focusing on teaching quality, attracting and retaining great teachers into our schools. I'm happy to talk about that in more detail. I just don't want my opening statement to be super long. Respectful relationships, $77 million to teach our kids about respectful relationships, Indigenous languages, First Nations languages in our schools, and investment in community language schools on the weekend as well. There's a range of other policies, but they're the kind of headline and highlight ones that I'm happy to talk about in more detail if people are interested.
That's great. Thanks, Tanya, for that. It's a great introduction of things and some statements that we'd be very happy with in amongst there. So that's fabulous. We might jump straight into the questions. We did put out a call for questions earlier last week. So our first one is from Rabbi Zalman Kastel, who's the founder of Together for Humanity, that promotes intercultural understanding. And Together for Humanity, for those who don't know, has partnered with ACSSO to put our professional learning for teachers in family engagement into an online platform. So good relationship there. So the Rabbi's first question is, the Australian curriculum changed last week to focus on Australia's Christian and Western heritage and diversity of communities. Would Labor be supportive of policies that ensure education reduces prejudice by A, ensuring the content of the curriculum includes deep understanding of diverse worldviews and cultural experiences, including but not limited to diverse religions, and B, by shifting accountability from mainly numeracy and literacy to also require schools to demonstrate effective strategies for fostering intercultural understanding?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I know Rabbi Kastel well, and I know the wonderful work that he does in interfaith understanding. Yeah. It's really great work. We wouldn't propose to reopen the curriculum debate at the moment. I mean, this is a curriculum, the new national curriculum's been agreed by the Commonwealth with all of the states and territories. And I think there's been a lot of sort of politicising of the curriculum by the federal government in an effort to sort of pick an American-style culture wars fight in Australia. We're not interested in making our kids the subject of culture wars fights in our schools. We just want them to get a really good education. And of course, that means having really good basics, being able to read and write and do maths and, making sure we get that right, but also talking to them about the sort of things that make them good human beings. And interfaith understanding is one element of that. It's also the reason that we're about to invest $77 million in better respectful relationships education in our schools, because we know that schools are really doing a great job in preparing people for life and work and the world and friendship and society and all of those things as well. I think having room in the curriculum for the sort of work that Rabbi Kastel and others do in promoting interfaith understanding is just a really valuable thing for our schools as well.
Yes, agreed. And I think you're right, the respectful relationships will marry very nicely with that intercultural understanding as well. Thank you for that.
And also, Sharon, I'd say that our schools really do a very good job of
Pretty good job at the moment. Yes, I agree.
I really think that, most kids today are much more able to identify things like exclusion, racism, unfairness of different types than certainly when we were at school. I think they've got the language for it now in a way that we didn't have when we were kids.
That's true.
Build on that strength. We shouldn't come to this sort of deficit model.
But there's obviously always more that can be done because there are vulnerable groups.
There's always more to do.
But you're right, not in a bad position at the minute. All right, so our next couple of questions are from our colleagues at WACSO, which is the peak body representing parents in government schools in Western Australia. The first question is, Western Australian schools report that parents of students with disability seek advice from teachers and staff when planning educational goals in their child's NDIS plan. Strong collaboration between the student's family, service provider, classroom teachers and the school administration is essential for supports to be provided in a classroom setting. So parents have highlighted there is an urgent need for specific roles that can support families in schools to ensure appropriate educational goals are included in NDIS plans and to streamline the delivery of supports in the classroom where appropriate. So if elected to government, would the Australian Labor Party fund roles that enable collaboration and links between families, the NDIS, service providers and schools to support improved outcomes for students with disability?
Yeah, we absolutely want to see improved outcomes for students with disability, and my colleague Bill Shorten, who is the Shadow Minister responsible for the NDIS, have spoken about this at length already. The first step is actually, I'd like to, if we're elected on Saturday, we'll do a rapid review of, just using the Education Department, of what's happened in education for kids with a disability and how the pandemic has affected learning. I don't want to spend a year doing it. I actually want a short, sharp look and discussion with parents about what the impact on kids has been and how we can catch up on any lost learning opportunities. I think too often systems are not ambitious enough for children with disability, and we need to change that. And too often the NDIS and education sort of funding has not married up nearly well enough for children with disability. So there's both an individual approach that we need to take for children to make sure that they're really genuinely getting the best education, in their particular school and their school setting. But there is a big systemic job to do as well, of trying to, break down the wall between education funding and NDIS funding, and just say, look, it doesn't matter to kids and their families where the money's coming from to provide the supports they need. What they need is the supports at home and in the classroom that will help them achieve their learning goals. So I'm going to start with actually getting a really good picture of the lay of the land, and then next steps after that, how do we fix this really not good enough interface between education funding and NDIS funding. I think that's the next step.
That sounds really good, and love that you're going to speak with parents about it, because they, along with their children, are the users and need to have that input there. And it also kind of lends itself to a question about, at the moment, under the National Disability Scheme, schools make sort of reasonable adjustments for children with additional needs, but families of those children would absolutely believe, quite correctly, that they should make the necessary adjustments, whatever they are. Reasonable is, can be defined differently by every person, every school. So we believe, as do those parents, that every necessary adjustment should be made for those children. So. Yeah,
and Sharon, can I say I agree with this principle that every child should be able to attend their local school and receive the support they need to do that. And my conversations with parents and students with disability and their parents is often that, two very similar schools, if you've got great leadership in one school, the welcome the child gets, the support the child gets, the adjustments that are made for that child is really very different to a school that from the outside looks identical. And in some cases, it really does come down to leadership and willingness. I think, sending a very strong message that there is an expectation that any child can attend any school, we start with that.
Yeah, sounds good. All right, the next question from our colleagues at WACSO. The effects of the changing climate and the lack of action to address climate change is undoubtedly a significant burden on the wellbeing of young Australians. Our public school systems are significant users of energy, water and other non-renewable resources. If elected to government, would the Australian Labor Party show leadership to our young people by formally acknowledging the impact of climate change on the lives of our young people and their mental health?
Well, I think one of the really important reasons to take action on climate change is because our kids and kids are going to be inheriting a very different world if we don't. And people keep saying, in the government, they keep saying, well, Australia's only responsible for 1.3% of global pollution, so it doesn't really matter what we do. That's not true in my view. We need to be part of a global effort to tackle climate change. We need to do our share. We need to show leadership, and our kids are really watching the way we handle this. They're looking at adults who are in denial about climate change, and they're despairing. Our kids are despairing at the lack of leadership. So we do have a pathway to get to zero net emissions. Under our plan, we'll see more than 80% of energy going into the national energy market, the grid coming from renewables. We also want to make sure that we are taking the job opportunities that being a renewable energy superpower offers us. So there's a really positive story to tell about taking action, both for the planet, for our environment, for the climate, but also for our economic development as a nation. Schools do have a real opportunity, as you've indicated, to be part of that, and we have had really good programs at different times where schools have either had solar panels on the roof or rainwater tanks installed, or energy efficiency upgrades. All of these things are really important because they save the school money for a start, but also because they show kids what's possible as well. Our kids are learning all the time from the stuff that's happening around them. And the opportunity, just taking solar panels as an example, I've seen some great state government programs where the schools, operating off the solar panels during the day, but particularly at peak times like the summer holidays, where local communities are using a lot of electricity for, to run air conditioners and pool filters and all those peak energy things. The power going back from the grid, back from the solar panels into the grid on weekends and those long summer holidays, like that, again, it's a really great opportunity to make use of the big lots of roof space you've got on some of those school buildings. So you save money from your own energy bills, but you also put energy back into the grid at the high use times. And, like school finishes at 3, maybe you've got teachers there till 4 or 5 o'clock, but in those summer months at 5 till 7 or 5 till 8, depending where you are in the country, again, really peak energy use as people are arriving home from work. We've got solar panels feeding back into the grid at that time. That's win, 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 win for everyone.
Absolutely, it is. The next question, the National School Chaplaincy Program provides additional wellbeing support to school communities through an agreement between the Australian Government and the states and territories. WACSO recognises the importance of non-clinical pastoral care in schools and the value many schools place on having the additional support of a chaplain. If elected to government, would the Australian Labor Party consider a review of the current NCSP arrangements to allow school communities the choice of non-faith-based youth and support workers in these important roles?
Yes, it's consistently been our policy, is that we think the chaplaincy program is valuable, but we expect people to be properly trained in an appropriate qualification like youth work, and we are open-minded about whether those chaplains come from a faith background or a secular background. We think it should be up to school communities to choose the person that meets the needs of their school community. But we do expect there to be a minimum qualification level, and of course we don't agree with proselytising in the school. Great,
thank you. So next questions relate to the National School Reform Agreements. With the current 80-20 funding division for the SRS of government schools, what ratio would a future Labor government see as giving the best outcomes for our school communities and their students?
Yeah, this is really, I don't want to give people a long history lesson on this, but The reason that we had higher Commonwealth contributions in places like the Northern Territory and Tasmania is because it's much harder for those small jurisdictions to raise revenue, and they have some of the most disadvantaged students in the country. And so the fact that this government's gone to a uniform contribution around the country, it's more uniform, but it's not actually necessarily fairer. But we are where we are. This funding agreement runs till the end of 2023. We will negotiate with the states and territories on funding share and how quickly we can get to 100% of the schooling resource standard in the next funding agreement and beyond. We need consistency and the opportunity to negotiate with the states and territories. I can't start putting dollar figures on that because it's a negotiation. I think your organisation is also interested in things like the way the state governments have been allowed to count depreciation against their share. They've been allowed to count student transport costs against their share. Like, all of these things need to be on the negotiating table in the discussions on the next funding agreement, because I don't think it's especially fair that those outside of the classroom costs of education have been counted in determining whether the states are meeting their responsibilities. I think basically the states and territories agreed to the last funding agreement because they only had to put in 75% of the fair funding level, and because all these external things were also counted. These are all things that we want to have on the negotiating table in the next funding agreement. We are prepared to improve the Commonwealth effort, but we would expect all of the states and territories also to lift their game and invest more in education as well. So I can't really start putting figures and proportions and percentages on the table at the moment, because it's a negotiation. I don't want to turn up at the house auction and say, by the way, I'm prepared to pay, whatever it is for that house. But these are the negotiating principles that we're going in with.
Okay, and yeah, we obviously would like to see the states and territories paying their full 80% of contribution to government schools, and no more than their 20% to the non-government sector, to be perfectly honest. So I think you've kind of answered the next couple of questions that had been sent in. Just having a quick look. I think so. That were in relation to that topic. So I'll just move on to last week. Sorry, go on.
Well, maybe one of the additional things to say about this is that for the non-government schools, there is a sort of trajectory built in for that as well, for them to come down to 100% where they're overfunded of the schooling resource standard. And we're not in the business of causing big sector by sector fights, but if we are really going to genuinely have a needs-based, sector-blind funding approach, we can't ignore the fact that the Commonwealth Government, in its current funding arrangements, has two sectors where it's aiming to get schools to 100% of the schooling resource standard, and one sector where its aim is to get schools to 95% of the schooling resource standard, and we're not even achieving that in most public systems around the country at the moment. I think it is really quite outrageous that, there's no way you can call that sector blind funding, because there is one sector that is currently effectively capped at 95% of their fair funding level. I'm not about punishing the Catholic and independent schools, but I cannot accept a scenario where public schools actually have a cap on their funding level.
Yep, sounds reasonable. Well then, do you have a timeline on when you would hope to see public schools at that 100% of SRS?
Again, this will depend a little bit on our negotiation with the states and territories, but I'd like to see it as quickly as possible. you know, we're going to have to work with the states and territories to do it, though. So I can't put a date on.
Yeah, all right. The sooner the better. Okay, moving on, there's been a focus last week in an announcement from Anthony Albanese on high achieving students, I think with an ATAR of 80 plus, receiving a scholarship or bursary to encourage them to enter the teaching profession. So does Labor believe that high ATAR results are the only indication of someone who has the potential to be a proficient teacher, or do you believe there are other criteria, considering it is said to be a calling and teachers need to have a certain passion? And how do we assess those criteria for university entry?
Yeah, well, I absolutely believe that teaching is a vocation, and I want people to be passionate about teaching, and I want them to love kids. Like, one of the most important things I think is understanding that this is a job that changes lives. You know, everybody knows that really good teachers change lives, and it's most particularly important to have really good teachers for kids who don't necessarily have the support at home to you know, either for their social and emotional well-being or for their academic achievement. If home is complicated, then teachers become even more important in that kid's life. So I 100% agree that you want to start with people who are passionate about the job. But I can tell you that systems that have more people who are academic high achievers in teaching get better results for their kids. So there will always be exceptions to this rule, right? There'll be young people who bombed out in year 12 because their parents were getting divorced, or they were couch surfing and homeless, or, you know, whatever complication was happening in their lives at the time. They had, you know, undiagnosed ADHD, whatever it is. They didn't do well in high school, but they have both the passion for teaching and they've got the capacity to do well academically and pass that on to the next generation. There needs to be alternative pathways into teaching. I'm thinking in particular, for example, of you know, remote Indigenous communities where the local classroom educators who are helping the trained teachers, so, you know, basically teachers' aides or whatever they're called in your particular state and territory, can get on a pathway to becoming a qualified teacher. They might not have a strong academic background, but they're going to make a great teacher. There has to be alternative pathways in. What I don't want is a system, which is what we've got at the moment, where the results to get into teaching degrees keep falling, and where universities are standardly taking people with ATARs in the 50s or the low 60s, because, first of all, I think a lot of those young people won't go on to do teaching as a career because they won't actually be good enough to do it. So you're wasting their time and you're wasting their money. Secondly, I think it sends a really bad signal. If you can be a teacher with an ATAR in the high 50s or low 60s, it's sending a message that teaching is not an important job, or that it's not a valuable job, or that it's not a prestigious job. We actually want to restore teaching, the prestige of teaching as a career. We want to be attracting people and keeping them in teaching who are, you know, the best and brightest of their generation, because it is critical, important work. I actually want people to be competing to get into the teaching in the way they compete to get into medicine, or, you know, vet science or dentistry or law. You know, I think it's so sad that we've got an acting education minister who said, like, a couple of months ago that the reason that our kids are struggling is because of all the dud public school teachers. Like, you know, where do you go with that when that's what the minister is saying? I want teachers to be respected by kids, by parents, and as a profession by society. And that starts obviously with political leadership. You're never going to hear me bagging teachers, but it also means lifting the bar to get into initial teacher education degrees, and it means making sure that there is a career path in classrooms that keeps our most experienced teachers in the classroom, that they can continue to have pay increases. They can work as highly accomplished or lead teachers. They can be mentoring early career teachers, but that we can keep those great people in the classroom and not be saying to them, if you want a pay rise, you have to go and be a deputy principal or a principal or go into head office, admin, leave teaching altogether, which is what we're saying to too many of them at the moment. And we know that we've got thousands of vacancies across teaching at the moment. Too many people are teaching out of their subject area of specialty, and 1 in 4 teachers are considering leaving the profession. That is a crisis in teaching. We can't allow that just to run unchecked. Sorry, I've talked too long on that one.
No,
I feel very strongly about it.
Not at all. And there was a question I saw pop up in, or a comment pop up in the chat as you were saying that you addressed right at the end there, teacher retention. And I think that the question in there was, could those monetary incentives that are set aside for young people to become teachers, could they be used, that may be used for retention in remote areas or hard to access teachers?
So 2 things. The bursaries that we're talking about, you get a higher amount if your prac is in a regional or rural area. So we do want people to be doing part of their study or part of their prac in a rural or regional or remote setting, because we know that people who work in those settings for a time, do their study or training in those settings, are much more likely when they graduate to stay in that community or a similar community. So we do want to prioritise that. We've also got, obviously, the mid-career change, we've set aside money for programs like Teach for Australia, Nexus, and other sort of mid-career change teaching programs. Again, they are generally tied to hard-to-staff schools, including in rural and remote communities. But the other thing is working with states and territories to expand on something we started when we were in government, those highly accomplished and lead teaching positions. Each state and territory is a slightly different sort of stage of the implementation of identifying these really skilled teachers and working out the incentive structures to keep them in the classroom. But we really want to do that. We want to give them time within their teaching load to specifically mentor and upskill other teachers. You can't expect them to be doing that for free in their own time, which is what a lot of teachers, experienced teachers, are doing at the moment.
That's
we
what
want
they're
it to
doing
be
now,
part of the job, and we want to remunerate them for that.
Yeah, and I also love the thought of the teachers' aides and SLSOs, whatever they're called, around the country, that you said they do have such amazing skills, and we need to find different pathways to get them advanced to teaching positions, because many of them are pretty much acting as teachers anyway in the classroom and getting fantastic results with some of our most vulnerable children. So that would be great if we could devise a pathway for them so that they could be paid according to their skill level.
And also, Sharon, I think one of the things we want to do with the bursary students is have them in classrooms much earlier, so that they're doing a day a week for a couple of days a week. And part of the benefit of that is, obviously, they decide much, there's no point spending three years or 4 years getting a qualification if the first year out you go, this is not for me. I don't want those people wasting their own time and money and the system time and money. I'd rather have fewer people studying teaching, but choose people who are going to be great teachers and really support them in their education. Make sure the initial degree is excellent and that the transition into the classroom is much smoother than it is, so that they start better prepared and they have more support in their early years of teaching, so that we can we're more likely to keep them in the classroom. But also, if you get some of those people who are students and doing it, a day a week or 2 days a week in the classroom, they can take some of the load off the classroom teacher, some of the admin load off the classroom teacher. And we also need to be looking at lightening the load, things like playground duty, other things that teachers are doing that are sort of not, you don't need someone who's qualified to be a teacher to do some of the roles that we're asking of teachers in the school. Can we lighten that burden of, the extra, all the extras that they're engaged in, and just let them do what their actual job is, which is teach kids.
Yeah.
Anyway, so
yeah.
we've got a bit of system reform to do.
Sense. So touching on teacher training and saying you don't want people wasting their time and money, obviously, if it turns out that whatever degree they're studying is not for them, what would Labor be looking at in terms of university costs?
Oh, well, we... a couple of things. We've got 20,000 extra university places for areas of skills shortage, and teaching is obviously one of those. We would be really looking at attracting more people with the right marks and or the right background into teaching courses. We've got to work with education faculties in the universities to make sure that as we try and attract more people, we don't drop the standard to get into the courses. That's really the balance that we're trying to get. We're not proposing to, other than the bursaries for the places that we're talking about, we're not proposing to change the costs at the moment, but within the university policy, aside from the extra 20,000 places, we're also looking to develop a universities accord with the universities, employers, unions and other interested parties, and looking at the cost of university education is one of the areas that we're looking at. At the moment, it really depends a lot on whether you're just doing a teaching degree or whether you're doing a master's like some institutions have, or if you do like a general, say, arts degree and then go and specialise in teaching. The costs really vary enormously depending on your pathway into teaching. But I'm pretty alarmed by the fact that an arts degree with a year of honours at the moment costs someone $58,000. That's really completely unsustainable.
Yeah, thank you. It is. Okay. So we saw in the 7:30 report last week before, that there is a perceived migration from government schools to the low fee paying non-government schools. And often the talk about lack of resources, funding, teacher shortages in the government system can make this a self-fulfilling prophecy. Just one example, in the highly marginal Braddon electorate in northwest Tasmania, we have an example of two neighbouring 7 to 12 high schools. One's a Catholic school with an index of community socio-economic advantage of 1,011 and combined government funding of $18,693 per student. And the other is a government school with an ICSIA value of 938 and combined government funding of $16,759 per student. So as a result, we have a non-government school in the top 50% of advantage that is receiving considerably more, almost $2,000 more, of government funding per student than the government school that is in the bottom 20% of advantage. So given that this is a scenario that is commonly reported across Australia, what would a future Labor government do to address this? And how would Labor get both departments of education and politicians to promote the value of living and learning in people's local communities?
Well, I think we go back to getting every school to its fair funding level, 100% of the schooling resource standard, and negotiating with the states and territories to do that in the next funding agreements. I know that there are people who think that the solution is to take money away from the non-government schools. I think my approach would be wherever we can to raise the funding level of the public system rather than reduce the funding to other systems. It's my intention to do that raise the funding for public schools, and we know that the non-government schools are on a trajectory down to 100% of the schooling resource standard as well. I think, and the other thing I really want to say is we want to make sure that the most disadvantaged schools get the biggest funding increases in the shortest time. So really focusing on those highly disadvantaged schools, and my objective in the next funding agreement is to make sure that we are pumping money into the most disadvantaged schools in the fastest possible time. If there are ways that we can do that in the meanwhile, like this $180 million that we've set aside for upgrading schools, for example, I'd be very much looking to do that, to direct funding to where it's most required. I think, you know, one of the big changes really is just having a government that believes in public education at a federal level would be a really good start, and having a government that believes that public education, you know, this government has always tried to say that the federal government's responsible for Catholic and independent schools and state governments are responsible for public schools. That's just made up. That's just, you know, that's just made up stuff, that the federal government doesn't have any responsibility for public schools. So I'm prepared, and my colleagues are prepared, to invest in public education in a way that this government has been trying to avoid the whole time.
That's good, and I recall you said at the beginning of our session that some capital works money would be coming back to government schools from the Fed, so that's nice to hear.
Sorry, just one other thing, just there's two sort of things that are already legislated that we're not proposing to change, and one is that trajectory to down, in some cases, to 100% of the schooling resource standard for overfunded schools. The other thing is, of course, the direct measure of income, which is the capacity to pay for parents in non-government schools, and that's also something that's currently legislated. So there are reviews down the track of some of these things, but it's worth reminding people that that both of those things are already in the legislation, and will help deal with this issue of overfunded schools more generally.
Okay, yep. So I guess from ACSSO's point of view, what we are really, really looking for is equity in funding, as opposed to even equality of funding. So yeah, looking after our most vulnerable, as you say, that's got to be the priority. So thank you for that. Post-lockdown, which seems like a little while ago now, but you know, who knows what's around the corner. But post-lockdown, parental anxieties about what their children have missed is creating a boom for private tutoring, and this is placing enormous additional stress on our young people and widening the gap between rich and poor. How would Labor address this issue to remove the stress and level the playing field?
Wow, this is a bigger question about where society's going, I think. But I'll try and answer the education part of it. The $440 million I was talking about at the very beginning of my opening remarks, Labor's plan to help our kids bounce back after COVID-19. As I said, about half of that is really for schools to use for social and emotional wellbeing, or if they want to. If they feel that the kids need extra one-on-one tuition in some cases, they can use the money for that. The issue of parental anxiety about kids falling behind, I think is a much bigger sort of societal issue, and we've seen some societies around the world where this, you know, kids are being tutored till 10 o'clock at night and going to school the next day and falling asleep on their desks, because it becomes a sort of social expectation that, you know, kids are being hothoused, and I really don't want to see that for Australian kids. I do think what that means, though, is that we do need to reassure parents that their kids are getting the basics under their belts. And I know that there are lots of people who've got concerns about testing like NAPLAN and the international testing like PISA and so on. And I think, you know, they've been around for long enough that we do need to look at the role that this sort of testing plays and how we do it in a way that's least stress for kids, and how we do it in a way that's actually useful to the learning of children. But we do need to reassure parents that their kids are getting the basics, and then all of the great stuff that comes on top of that. Because as a parent, I want to know that my kids can read and write and do maths, but I also want them to be exposed to music and art and sport and languages and a whole rich kind of offering, educational offering. So good. So, you know, what do we need to do? We need to provide schools with the ability to meet those post-COVID anxieties that parents have, and to give them the funding to do that. And we also need to be talking to parents a lot, like that homeschool communication that was so good during COVID-19 in most schools. Maybe not every school, but almost every parent I've spoken to, most school communities I've spoken to say, I know more about what my kid was doing at school during that time than I ever have before. Being able to learn from that and have a really good communication with parents about how their kids are progressing, what they're learning at the moment, how they're going in their education. I think there are ways that we can reassure parents by keeping them in the loop in that way, that can really relieve some of the anxiety that parents are facing. And again, it does come down to the way that we talk about education as well. It's a real balance, isn't it? Because if we keep talking about the failures of the system, the deficits of the system, we feed the anxiety. But if we ignore the concerns that parents have, then they go, well, you're not meeting my expectations for my child, you're not listening to me, I'm going to try a new system. So actually getting that balance right, I think, is something that we need to continue to work on.
Yes, acknowledging their anxieties, but saying it's not all doom and gloom, and here's what we can do to help fix what you're worrying about.
What we can do, but also here are the highlights. Here are our
absolutely. Let's promote the great stuff that's happening. And family engagement is what ACSSO is all about. And that might be my very last question, because I know we're a little bit over time. Would a Labor government look at funding community liaison or family liaison officers in public schools across the country? Someone who would be that conduit between the school and the family, who would engage the parents and the family in general as genuine partners in their children's education.
You're going to have to leave that one with me, Sharon, because I haven't contemplated it in the past, and I don't have any idea what kind of cost we're talking about, so I can't just commit to you on the spot. But I can say, though, that this home school connection, or the communication between home and school, I think a lot of early career teachers say they don't feel confident in handling it. They don't feel like they've been trained in that element of their job particularly well. And I know that some schools, like, you know, essentially wealthier schools, put a lot of resource into this, and it works really well, because it means that schools and parents are on the same page about their child's education, which can only be good for kids. So I need to think about, I would need to know more about how the cost and all the rest of it, but I do really see the value in what you're talking about. I can see how important it is to make sure that parents and schools have that great communication, and that it's not that it's not additional to everything else that we're trying to get schools to do. No,
absolutely. It should be embedded. And you're right, talking about the readiness. The pre-service teacher training virtually doesn't touch on family engagement. And that's a plug for our online family engagement professional learning for teachers. But we're working with the universities to get something happening pre-service as well. But
Do you know, Sharon, I've spoken to the OECD has an education section where they do, they study high performing school systems around the world, and they comment on Australia's system every few years, and they say this is what you could do to improve. But in one of their reports I was reading about, now I can't remember who it was, I'm pretty sure it was the Japanese school system, it might have been Singapore, but essentially teachers have, substantially fewer hours in the classroom face-to-face teaching in a week, but they would ring every parent in their class about once a fortnight to discuss how the kid's going. And you just think about what a difference that would make.
Absolutely.
Especially picking up, picking up problems before they become massive problems. If you're doing that sort of stuff regularly and there's an expectation of doing it. I sometimes feel like, when schools are under pressure or teachers are under pressure, the only time parents hear from teachers is when their kids are misbehaving and they're they're having a problem. And as a parent, that always feels like a sort of negative interaction. Whereas if we structure more time in for this earlier on, and teachers are given the space, they're not having to do it in their own time. This is set as a part of their job, and in the hours that they're actually paid for, rather than all the unpaid work they're expected to do. Sure. You can often, steer this in the right direction much earlier on.
Yes, agreed. And if you've already got that good relationship, because you have been engaging with the families and the parents in particular, if there is ever an issue, as you said, you can have a much easier conversation than if you're just calling cold and have never spoken to them about their child before. Well, thank you very, very much for giving up your time to be with us today. We really appreciate it. I think there might be questions and comments in the chat, but I know we're out of time, so we will have a look at those, and if there's anything we need to come to you, we'll send those through to your office, if that's all right.
Of course.
But thank you so much for your time this morning. Thanks, Tanya.
A pleasure to talk to you, and and always I love the great relationship we have with your organisation, but also with all of the state organisations as well. Thank you very much for the opportunity today.
Thank you. Bye.